with that, I'd like to introduce Phil Round. And Phil is a professor of English, and I'll do the official, I know Phil well personally, but I'll pretend like he's, an actually professor here at the university, which he is very distinguished. But Phil is professor in English and American Indian Native Studies at the University of Iowa, where he coordinated the American Indian Studies program for 4 years. In 2004, he received a CIC faculty fellowship in American Indian Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He's published 3 books. He's been twice awarded a J. William Fulbright Fellowship. But the reason that he is here is that he has also published one of his earlier books, was called By Nature and by Custom Cursed, Transatlantic Civil Discourse in New England Cultural Production. So his background, even though it's in English and American Indian Studies, has a lot to do with his political discourse and history of that. And Phil's also a wonderful person and a good speaker. So with that, that's around.
No pressure. Thank you very much, Pete. And I do appreciate this opportunity to introduce our distinguished guests who are in the arena of helping to try to mediate some of what has become uncivil speech in American politics. And hearing from them is more important than hearing from me. But Pete did ask me to give you a little bit of historical contexts because this part of the program is about the history of American political discourse. I'm not a historian, but I am a historian of discourse, which might seem weird, but that actually exists. How people have spoken over the years in America and written is one of the things I study. So I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about some of the history in America. And I know I have just a couple of minutes. I won't take up all your time, but I do want to go back to the 4th century BC, if you don't mind. Most of the discussions about what is civil discourse flow from Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote a book called Rhetoric, in which he described the things you probably learned in school somewhere along the line, things about syllogisms, things about the ethical appeal, about the logical fallacy, things like that. But Aristotle wasn't naive, and the opening sentences of the Rhetoric kind of sum up where we are when we look at the history of any political discourse anywhere. Aristotle said, to a certain extent, all men attempt to discuss statements and to maintain them, to defend themselves and to attack others. And so Aristotle's Rhetoric is really not only a manual for how to do that, but also a manual for how to listen to that, how to read that, and how to interpret that, how to decide, is that argument a legitimate one on all the terms we've heard the representative and President Mason discuss. I do want to then look back at the United States and think about moments when that particular line or that particular practice has been broached. We've already heard about the famous, probably the nadir of American political incivility, and that would be the Sumner case of 1856. But I want to take you back even further and make you realize that before there was a United States, in the 1630s and 40s, Massachusetts General Court was a very important model for our early American United States government. And the General Court was very, very concerned with policing political speech. And its most famous policing of political speech turns on something I didn't hear a lot about yet, and I hope during the course of the symposium we will, and that is gender. The very first woman excommunicated from the polity of Massachusetts was Anne Hutchinson. She was first removed from her church, but then by the Massachusetts General Court removed for what they called heated speech, based on their belief that the Pauline injunction against women speaking in churches applied to civil society as well. And I think women in the room here who remember some of the recent political debates in which women have played an important role can hear echoes of those kinds of concerns around the discourse of gender as women try to engage in civil society as well. So that's the first example. The second example I want to give you is the first great political campaign where political parties were involved, the 1800 campaign. Thomas Jefferson won, much to John Adams' great and ongoing and forever chagrin. his family never forgot that loss. But what happened in 1800, Jefferson said in a letter, was that Federalists, his opponents, approached him afterwards and said to him, and I quote from a letter, "They say we lied them out of power, and they now openly avow that they will do the same to us." And sure enough, in 1804, Thomas Jefferson, who was open to some criticism, experienced a vituperative attack from the Federalists, first about his illicit affair with this enslaved Sally Hemings, but also about his lack of Christian religious orthodoxy. I quote from a campaign editorial. "This man Jefferson is a defiler of Christian virtue, a companion of the most vile, corrupt, obnoxious sinner of the century." That sinner that was being referred to there was none other than Tom Paine. I want to close with a final upbeat example from American political history. One of the things we see about American political incivilities, it tends to occur a lot during times of stress, economic or political stress. The Sumner event, of course, occurred just before a civil war that's the ultimate incivility, right? We actually began killing each other over the question of being American. However, in exactly the same time, in 1856, two men came together in what is probably the paramount example of the best in American civil discourse, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And even though, and I went back and read the debates in preparation for this, in some part to see how civil they were not polite. They were not unengaged. They were doing what Aristotle said, defending themselves and attacking others, both Lincoln and Douglas. But what they were, and I quote from an editorial in the New York Tribune of 1858, what they were was not merely a passage at arms between two eminent masters of art, of the intellectual attack and defense, but they touched on some of the most vital principles in our political system, and no man can carefully peruse them without some benefit, whatever his convictions, as to the issue at hand. And that would be what we are trying to talk about today. Being able to engage in a vigorous, and I'll tell you, those Lincoln-Douglas debates are vigorous, debate, and yet come away with a faith in our institutions and also a faith in our feeling that the sides were argued fairly. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Both of these men are great to have here. They're right in the middle of things. And I think John Avlon is going to go first.
Yep.
John Avlon is a senior columnist for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, as well as a CNN contributor. He's the author of Independent Nation, How Centrists Can Change American Politics, and one of my favorite book titles of recent years, Wingnuts, How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America, as well as a co-editor of an anthology called Deadline Artists. Previously, John was a columnist and associate editor for the New York Sun and chief speechwriter for New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Avlon has appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS, and C-SPAN. He's spoken at the Kennedy School of Government, the Citadel, the State Department's Visiting Journalist Program, and civic organizations around the nation. Columnist Kathleen Parker wrote, quote, "Americans who are fed up with the Ann Coulter, Michael Moore school of debate are looking for someone to articulate a common sense middle path, and they may have found that voice in John Avlon."
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I appreciate this conference. In all sincerity, this is important. This is a conversation we need to be having nationally. And so I want to thank the University of Iowa for putting it together and having the vision to follow through with this idea. And may it be the first of many, because it is an urgent problem right now. How we balance principled disagreement with constructive approach to solving problems. That is really what's happening right now. I mean, and what I'd like to speak about a little bit today is how hyperpartisanship has hijacked our national debates all too often, and how we might be able to heal it. And first giving it a broader sense of perspective, because perspective is the thing we seem to have least of in our politics today. Perspective is that thing that not only gives us a sense of the past and where we came from, but it's rooted in that idea that ultimately there's more that unites us than divides us as Americans. And that can temper passions at our best. It's the idea that Thomas Jefferson spoke about after that very contentious first election, where he said every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. That's an idea we need to remember right now as Americans. And I think that's really one of the fundamental things that the Founding Fathers were trying to bequeath to us. Just look at the national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one. That's the big idea. Yes, we're diverse. Yes, we've got all these interesting differences, but ultimately there's more that unites us than divides us. Now look, along with a sense of perspective comes what's been said earlier, which is that politics ain't beanbag. All right? You know, people throw elbows. It can be a full contact sport, and that's okay up to a point. George Will once said that the four most important words in politics are up to a point. And that sense has been lost. Look, the Founding Fathers did have vigorous debates, but that doesn't excuse any vitriol that comes out of anyone's mouth today, and sometimes it's used that way. We have had cane beatings. We have had, of course, a civil war. These are rooted on some principal disagreements about the nature of our government that echo today less violently. More recently, I mean, Herbert Hoover, Iowa's only president, and I'm proudly biased in this regard because my wife is on the board of the Hoover Library and his great-granddaughter, but Herbert Hoover had to deal with $1 million budget being put solely to defame his character by a guy named Charlie Michelson by the DNC at the time. That's a lot of money to defame someone's character. And on the other hand, when FDR was president, he was called a socialist and a communist on the floor of the Senate. So we have played with these forces before. Demagogues always do well in economic downturns. In the 1930s, we saw Father Charles Coughlin on the right, and the radio priest, and we saw Huey Long on the left. So these forces do tend to get more excited during periods of economic downturn when people are anxious and especially susceptible to that classic demagogue's pitch of us against them. That doesn't mean, however, that we should accept these things as inevitable extensions of our political discourse, and it doesn't mean that we should somehow think that, oh, we've been here before, so it'll all just cure itself. In some measurable ways, things are getting worse. And this is an academic institution, so I can apologize slightly less for nerding out on you, but I'd just like to throw up one slide that puts this in perspective. This is one of my favorite slides, and basically this shows congressional voting patterns from 1955 to 2004. And what you see broadly here is how the strength of the vital center in Congress has eroded over time. That 1955, and this in many ways is the basis of the great work of the Bipartisan Policy Center. This is what has been lost. This is measurably what has been lost. In 1955, in that sort of classic, Eisenhower, as president, Lyndon Johnson as Senate Majority Leader, the two parties have considerable overlap. There are, and this almost sounds like a mythic thing, there were progressive Republicans, let's call them, it's less pejorative, in the Lincoln tradition, and there were conservative Democrats. The parties were not as ideologically stratified as they are today, nor were they as geographically stratified. And as a result, what you had is you had the capacity for interesting cross-aisle coalitions. Divided government didn't mean dysfunctional government. Divided government, Republican in the White House and Democrats running the Senate, resulted in the Interstate Highway Act. We got civil rights bills through. What you start to see is the parties become more ideologically divided, beginning with the 1964 Goldwater nomination, which is predicated in part upon voting against the Civil Rights Act. It starts to realign the South from the Democrats after 100 years to the Republican column. These divisions get deeper. 1975, you see a post-Watergate reaction, a slight swing to the left. But then this starts really to metastasize, to the point where our voting patterns in Congress no longer are representative of broadly American opinion. They don't follow that classic bell curve, where of course you have people on the far right, and of course you have people on the far left, but broadly speaking, the massive majority of voters are in the middle. Generationally, you can see this in the increase of independent voters, now 40% of the electorate. And many of those independents, especially Gen X and younger, will say, well, I'm closer to the Republicans on economic issues, Democrats on social issues. But because of the stratification and polarization in Congress, that perspective is not represented. Instead, what you see is what we have here, and it's in fact gotten worse. The center is virtually unrepresented. Instead of having a bell curve, you've got sort of, a dromedary. You've got nothing in the middle. You've got the poles of the parties further out than ever before. This is just by way of saying that it's not your imagination, that things are getting worse, that this creates a dynamic that polarizes our politics further. And it's self-reinforcing. You know, this is the line of the, you know, this is where people say, oh, the only thing in the middle of the road are yellow lines and dead armadillos. You know, that sense that it's politically unwise to try to stand in the center. And if you talk to people in Congress, you do get a sense often they're good people trapped in a bad system. But they know the way to solve the problem. Just look at the supercommittee today. We know the way to solve this problem. The question is not a lack of plans, it's a lack of political will, because the folks who reach across the aisle are afraid they're going to get it killed. They're going to get attacked from both sides. And incidentally, to that yellow line, I always like to quote Eisenhower, who used to say that the middle of the road is all the usable surface. The extremes of left and right are in the gutters. So I think there's a more durable, appropriately highway metaphor for the strength of the center. But so things have gotten worse. We've got a situation that is where politics has become polarized to the extent that it's unrepresentative of the American people. The parties are deeply polarized. The American people are much less so. The American people are not. I do think, just pivoting forward briefly, that there are ways to heal this. This is not inevitable. In part, this is a function of rules that have been put in place. I think election reform and congressional reform are key to healing this harsh but ultimately artificial polarization of our political process. I think if we had open primaries and redistricting reform to heal sort of the rigged system of redistricting, which has helped artificially polarize the process, you would see some of these divisions decrease, simply because politicians are responding rationally to incentives. If you've got a closed partisan primary in a safe seat where there's no general election, you're going to have lifetime employment unless you lose a closed partisan primary with around 10% turnout average nationally. In that dynamic, 5.1% of the electorate is a majority. That is a paradise for ideologues and activists. And the classic role of reaching out, forming new coalitions gets eroded. There's no profit in that. What we're seeing in recent years is even more amazing. It's politics being played by talk radio rules, in which there is no such thing as too extreme, and it's actually a profit-making strategy for politicians today. They know they can throw bombs, ignore kind of reaching out across the aisle, but they will raise millions, literally millions of dollars of national activist cash. That's frankly what fueled the beginning of Michelle Bachmann's presidential campaign. She had $13.5 million in the bank from her last reelect. And again, from national activist money. So I do think that if we had open primaries and redistricting reform, it would help heal things. Congressional reform is also important. I just did a column on this, and No Labels is going to, I think, be focusing increasingly on it. You know, filibuster reform. You know, if y'all watch the classic, wonderful, should be mandatory to every new incoming class of congressmen scene where Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith goes to Washington, stands up and does the filibuster. Well, that's how it was done. I interviewed Congressman Jim Cooper, who I think is one of the good guys in this fight, the other day, and he said, well, you know, even if it was Strom Thurmond, he had to risk his bladder. Now you just send somebody down, staffer down to sign some paperwork. So the hassle factor of filibuster has been removed, and as a result, it's implemented not once a year, twice a year, but 70 times, 60, you know. It is a routine parliamentary maneuver right now that creates not just a simple majority threshold, but a supermajority threshold. Same thing with secret holds. There have been attempts to reform secret holds, but any senator has the power of no on steroids, where he can hold up any legislation or nomination. Now, both parties do this, right? We had a problem with, you know, appointees in whether it was Clinton the presidency, Bush presidency, now the Obama presidency. You know, we can require things like there should be 90 days where any presidential nomination gets a hearing, that 100 co-sponsors of a bill should give it an up or down vote. These are all things we have control of, and they would help depolarize the process. You're not going to take the politics out of politics, and you're never going to remove partisanship, however George Washington might have hoped, and however I sometimes hope as well. But there are things we can do to heal the harsh but artificial partisanship, hyper-partisanship of our politics today, that lead directly to the kind of incivility, that tendency to demonize people who disagree with us. And the media is a huge part of this. The media is a huge part of this. We've had the fragmentation of media. So the really smart market strategy is something called cocooning. You play to a narrow but intense niche audience. That's how you get the best results. And what that does is, look, politics and media then become very self-reinforcing. They try to focus on a narrow tribal identity, in effect. And hate is a cheap and easy recruiting tool in this medium. You try to demonize the other side, convince people their political opponents are their enemies. But what might be good for ratings in a very narrow sense can be really bad for the country. And you reap what you sow, and that's part of what we're seeing right now. So at the end of the day, I am hopeful. But these forces are real. It's not your imagination. In some measurable ways, it has gotten worse. We shouldn't simply indulge these forces because we've seen them before. They shouldn't give us false comfort. At the end of the day, there is something deeply practical about the golden rule. Treat others as you'd like to be treated. Whatever party is in majority or minority would be affected by the same current, by these congressional reforms I discussed. It's better for the party in power or the party in the minority, actually, to have, automatic filibuster. But, we shouldn't be looking at this in terms of tactics and situational ethics. We really need to start thinking about making our government function again. Because hyperpartisanship's hurting our country. It is stopping us from solving serious problems. And it ultimately will be a crisis of self-governance. And I think we need to think of it in those terms. There's an urgency to this. So I would just say that I still subscribe to what Teddy Roosevelt once said, that decency can be the most practical form of politics. I think Iowa, because of your disproportionate influence in our politics, can help set that tone. I think it's consistent with the character of Iowa. And you can reward the candidates that try to, take the high road, not the ones who go nuclear on their opponents. And at the end of the day, this is a deeper, older tradition. I get frustrated, and I'm just closing up right now, when some folks, especially in partisan media, try to pretend that there's nothing more American than treating politics as an ideological blood sport. It's not. That is a fundamental, intentional misreading of American history designed to excuse the extremes on their own side and to kind of set off the cycle of incitement. And George Washington, in his farewell address, spoke to these forces very directly. And this was intentionally, he was sending a message to future generations. And he warned, he said, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities. It is itself a frightful despotism. That is the cycle we're seeing right now that is polarizing the votes in Congress, that cycle of incitement. And he said, look, there's something natural about wanting to have parties. It's not about denying that. It's not about denying the necessity of a vigorous debate with principal disagreements. It's a matter of balance. He said, they're being in danger of a constant danger of excess, he said. The effort ought to be by force of public opinion to mitigate and assuage it, a fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming it should consume. And I think that's where we're at. And that's part of the purpose of this conference as I see it, to make sure that the fires of a vigorous civic and political debate warm our country and enlighten it and not consume our capacity for self-government. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We're lucky now to have John Fortier with us, who is, I think, produced some of the numbers we're looking at. No, but he does.
Don't disagree with him.
Okay, he's a leading figure in producing this kind of information we need to decide where we really are and where the line is. He's a political scientist at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a DC-based think tank that promotes bipartisanship. He's the author of Absentee and Early Voting, Trends, Promises, and Perils, the author and editor of After the People Vote, A Guide to the Electoral College, and author and co-editor of Second Term Blues, How George W. Bush Has Governed. Previously, Dr. Fortier was a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also served as principal contributor to the A.E. Brookings Election Reform Project, the executive director of the Continuity of Government Commission, and the project manager of the Transition to Governing Project. He was also a regular contributor to the AEI's Election Watch series and is a regular columnist for The Hill and Politico. Dr. Fortier is a frequent commentator on elections and government institutions and has appeared on ABC's Nightline, CNN, Fox News, PBS NewsHour, among others. He has a PhD in political science from Boston University and a BA from Georgetown. Thank you, John.
Thank you. One small correction: Boston College, not Boston University. You know, there's a sort of incivility that runs down Beacon Street in Boston, where I'm from. So there are probably more wounds on that street than others. Thank you so much. Thank you to your University of Iowa. Thank you to Pete Damiano for putting this all together. I'm going to agree a lot with what John said, although I think we both put things in the context of our political polarization. There clearly has been incivility in the past. I think we had several good explanations of some of the key events. I'm not going to go back to the 4th century BC, where I will note was a more hopeful time when the Greeks used to pay their debts. And, but I do think that the period that John is talking about, the post-war period, is instructive in thinking about where we are today. In fact, an incredibly different world. When I teach students sometimes about Congress, you could be teaching a very, very different institution if you're thinking about the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And not just the parties and the voting system, but in a way the whole structure of the system, which certainly contributes to polarization, to incivility, but also makes it much more difficult to solve. So I think some of John's cautions on this are correct. And I'm going to try to walk through some of the ways in which this is developed and think about ways it's pervading our system and also some things that we might do about it. I talk to a lot of former members, and there's a very common theme that I hear, that the institution of Congress has changed, and that it was better before. People knew each other. People knew each other across the aisle. People knew each other socially. People had more direct working relationships on committees or with co-sponsorships and bills. And this is a common lament. And as a political scientist, I sometimes look at that with some skepticism and think, well, maybe that's just talk of the good old days. But there certainly is some truth to this. And if we start thinking about how the institution has changed, then we can think some ways about how some of the problems today are difficult to solve. But there might be some answers to this. They in particular mention that they don't stay in Washington as much. They go home a lot more. That they don't have family interactions. That they don't go on trips with other people. That they don't have time for other people. That they don't have good relationships between leaders of committees, between leaders at the top of the House or the Senate. So all of these things are very commonly heard in the participants themselves. It's not just people from the outside saying, this isn't working very well. But let me take you back to this earlier party system, the one that's illustrated by the former slide, where voting patterns were different, where the parties looked very different, and because of that, why Congress looked very different, and why some of those who are celebrating this past era, certainly do have a different model to look at. And here we had two parties which were not armed camps in opposite political sides of the debate. Today, where we think of our parties as being centered maybe around the 20-yard lines of a football field, there certainly were lots of people in both parties who were at the 50-yard line or over the 50-yard line, playing in the other party's territory. The majority party was clearly the Democratic Party for many years. You can know all the statistics, the 40 years straight the Democrats held the House, or the all but 4 years from 1930 to 1994 where they held the House. But it was a funny party. It wasn't a unified party. It was a party with a progressive larger part, but also a very conservative right wing in the South. And those parts didn't always play well together. It wasn't always a story of great harmony and a great agreement. And the Republican Party, a little less so, but certainly had a great diversity too, with liberal Republicans in the Northeast, a greater regional diversity as well. And what this meant was, while Democrats were always in charge for this long period of time, there were lots of cross-party coalitions, and some very regular ones. We studied, political scientists, the conservative coalition, identifying when conservative Democrats allied with Republicans to be an effective majority on some issues. When the progressive majority, or progressive larger part of the Democratic Party, would have to seek out a certain number of votes from Republicans to pass something because they didn't have all those votes in their own party. So there were two parties overlapping, and especially the Democratic Party with two wings that didn't agree very much. Now, what did that mean for the way Congress worked? Congress was much less centralized. We think of speakers of the House, and a very important speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, as being a long time and a powerful speaker, and in a sense he was. But compared to today's speakers, he didn't have the tools to rule his party and this caucus the way that today's speakers do. I don't mean that just today John Boehner or yesterday Nancy Pelosi, but the most recent speakers, especially since Newt Gingrich. And the reason that these speakers weren't so powerful is because they couldn't get all Democrats together and say, hey, let's get a common platform, let's support common candidates, let's be on the same page, let's be on the same team. And for that reason, the Democratic caucus really didn't meet in the House of Representatives. I think today, or the caucus, the group of Democrats, is a very powerful group, and you don't want to go against them, but there was not agreement. They wouldn't even get together to talk about things. So party power was devolved to committees, was devolved to a lower level, was seniority was emphasized. So instead of saying who was most loyal to the party, or who could raise the most money for the party, or who was most ideologically sympathetic to the party to be a chairman of a committee, you would say, well, who was there the longest? Who would work their way up? And that was a simple way for this majority party to award leadership. And so you had, instead of one party with one view, you had lots of little power centers around. And again, that contributed to a kind of working across the aisle. Committees themselves had an ethos, a esprit de corps where they could tell leadership or others to stay away, get out of our business. We want to do this bill. Dan Rostenkowski, the famous chairman of the House and Ways Committee, wasn't going to hear from his speaker that they had a suggestion for how he should write a tax bill. They were going to do it. They were going to do it, yes, with a Democratic majority on the committee, but with significant input from Republicans, and there was a kind of working together. Now I've told you the positive side of this old system, but truth be told, many people hated it. Right? It was criticized by all sorts of people, and it was criticized for the exact opposite reasons that we are thinking we have problems today. The criticism came from, sometimes from Republicans, especially later in the process, thinking, well, we're in the minority all this time. I know we get to kind of have some input, but we'd like to sometimes have power. But importantly, it came from people who thought about the system. Political scientists famously had a manifesto of sorts, which was asking for more responsible parties. Why they'd say, would you have parties that didn't really stand for anything? Why would you have parties that if you elected a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress, that you really didn't know what they were going to do? Or if you didn't know whether the Democratic president would have some program and would find it being blocked by another Democrat, by conservative Democrats in Congress. Incredibly, the House Rules Committee, which today is really an arm of the Speaker, which uses its power to schedule bills and decide how many amendments will be allowed on a bill, was actually in control of a conservative Democrat who often opposed the House Speaker or opposed the Democratic president. So there was a lot of criticism of this system. It's blocking important things getting done. Some civil rights things were passed, but some, of course, were held up by this system. But also that it didn't allow parties to be responsible, to have vision, to have voters know what they were getting. And the ideal system for these reformers was a kind of parliamentary, responsible party government where voters would know exactly what they're getting. They'd put a party in power. That party would either perform or not perform, and then the next election would take them out. They felt that everything was, accountability was diffused by the system. And in many ways, they've gotten what they've wanted, right? We've had this long change over time, and it certainly did have some weaknesses, but now the pendulum has swung, almost as far as you can imagine in the other direction where there are other weaknesses. And I won't go through all of them. John's slide from before illustrates this, but you can go through many things in Congress where voting patterns of representatives are measured, and the most liberal Republican is to the right of the most conservative Democrat, has been for several Congresses now. Occasionally you have somebody drift over on the other side, but really the voting patterns are very much separated, left and right. The regional realignment has happened, of course. The South is primarily Republican conservative whites and African-American Democrats. There are a few white conservative Democrats left in the system, which used to be all white conservative Democrats, essentially. After this election, I'm looking at the map and thinking there might not be a single white blue dog from the South. Blue dogs are the group that represents themselves as sort of the most moderate Democrats in Congress. And with redistricting, with retirements, with a number of things, there could be very few. Jim Cooper may be the only one, although I've seen a map that tries to take him out as well.
Oh, I'm sure.
So it really is possible that this story, which I find myself writing a column about almost every election cycle thinking we've gone as far as we can go and we've knocked out every little moderate out there. They continue, the last ones are still being picked off. And I think we may not see a huge change in seats overall in redistricting, but we're certainly going to see some continuing realignment where Republicans shore up their strength in conservative areas and Democrats in more liberal areas. So all sorts of things point to this new system where the parties are tremendously on one side or the other. One last piece of evidence. In 2010, 12 of the 13 most conservative districts the Democrats held, they lost, right? So the win was many seats for Republicans, but there were almost all the conservative seats and some moderately conservative seats and a few, maybe you'd say, slightly Democratic seats, but not a whole lot of seats out of whack. Lots of people, conservative seats have Republicans, liberal seats have Democrats. We've aligned ourselves almost perfectly. Now, if I had stopped this story here, I could say, well, it's just Washington, D.C. And here I don't know if I have a disagreement with John, but I think there's a mixed case about the people. I don't want to leave the people completely off the hook. There are some ways in which the people are less polarized and some ways in which the story goes further than Washington. It's very easy to hate Washington and to hate Congress. One recent survey had 9% of people approving of the job of Congress, and that's less than car salesmen or serial killers or I don't know what other maybe a group you want to, maybe not serial killers, but a significant, very, very low opinion of Congress. But in some ways the people are polarized as well. A couple of ways. We have many people we call independents. By lots of measures, independents are bigger than they ever have been. People in surveys call themselves independents. Often a bigger group than Republicans and Democrats, but looking deeper at independents, you find that most of them have pretty regular voting patterns. They vote Republican, they vote Democrat. A lot of pollsters think, what's the slice of the electorate that really is persuadable, that could go either way, that doesn't regularly lean one way or the other? And they find that slice to be pretty small, 10%, 15%. So in many ways, we have the signs of people in the middle, independents, but in fact, we don't have them quite as much. And that is reflected in campaigns, which often are seeking to turn out the base and not so much to persuade the middle. Obviously, it's better to do a little of both, but turn out the base is a significant part of a strategy. Living together. There are certainly a number of studies, one famously, the Big Sort, which says that people tend to live more with their like-minded fellows. So you find that your suburb, your city, your state is more red or more blue than it used to be. So you're hearing the echo chamber, you're living with your fellow partisans. Education. Wouldn't education be a good thing? Make people less partisan. If you're more educated, you'd be more reasonable, you'd take all sorts of arguments into account, and you would not follow blindly one party or the other. Well, it turns out the more educated you are, the more partisan you are. The more Republican or Democratic you are, you in some ways think about the system more, you rationalize the system, it's more intellectual. It's the least educated people that tend to fall sometimes in this persuadable group in the middle. So those are all reasons to think that it's not just Washington. Now, John rightly said that there are ways in which the people aren't being fully represented. And here, there is evidence and interesting political science research that says the set of issues that people believe in, their policy positions, they do fall more in the middle. Not that everybody's in the middle, but not everybody buys every piece of the farthest right wing or the farthest left wing ideology. They may have parts of that, but their whole distribution of policy preferences is much more in the middle than the two parties in Washington. And so that is something that people might grab onto to say, look, there's a way in which we have to find a way to have our voices heard, to represent those more moderate policy views. But again, those people are also pretty loyal to one party or the other. What to do? First my talk, I can say all this and it's going to sound incredibly pessimistic. There's nothing to do. I do think that there is a pendulum, and we're at one end of the pendulum, and we're not likely to do one thing that just swings everything back. There's an argument that says the 50s and 60s were kind of an odd time in American politics. We probably should have somewhat more divided parties. But that we could find ways to mitigate that swing, to bring it back a little bit, or to recognize that, yes, we're in a polarized world, but there are institutions and ways of acting and ways that Congress can act that could find ways to to find some compromise. In some ways, the Bipartisan Policy Center is dedicated to the idea that there are some strong differences on policy issues, and that often the way of getting things done in Washington is to take those stronger policy views, to hash them out, a commission-like structure, to find some things that are common ground on, that could be the basis for legislation. So I do think there is some hope in a number of ways. I do think redistricting, party primaries, are worth looking at, and I think they could be positive developments in this direction. Now, my political science hat tells me not to say that too strongly or too loudly, because the research shows that on redistricting, there's a debate in political science whether it has a small effect or a kind of medium small effect. It's not going to transform the world to change redistricting. The Senate is polarized, all sorts of other institutions are polarized, but some move in that direction. And here in Iowa, where I had a very interesting couple hours on the Iowa redistricting system yesterday, I think there is some hope in a number of states that are looking to either Iowa or other models. In fact, we're doing a study to look at the ways in which states can move away from political redistricting. So I think that's a possible way to go. Party primaries are absolutely controlled by extremes and by a small number of people showing up. Again, I'm interested in things like the California top 2 primary, Washington State, but I haven't completely signed on because I think it's an experiment that we'll have to see. Does it really increase turnout? Does it really bring in a broader electorate? If it does, I think it's a good thing. But other ways of increasing the people who show up to pick the candidates from both parties would be very helpful. And then I do think that, again, some of these things are from another era, but the ways of making Washington work better. Some of them are social and getting people together and working across the aisle, but some of them are strengthening institutions like committees, where people are forced to work very substantively on things across the aisle in a way that isn't always listening to their leadership or their party people at home. More time in Washington, D.C. We too are working on congressional reform and doing a number of things. I mostly, again, have agreed with John. I'm going to have one civil disagreement with him, or civil raising of a question, and that is the question of filibuster reform in the Senate that John brings up. A lot of people are concerned with this, and there's good reason to think that, of course, if you're worried about getting things done, why would you want this supermajority hurdle in the Senate? What I wonder is it related to this question of polarization and civility? In some ways, you could argue it's the opposite. The Senate, it's difficult to get things done, but the Senate is also a place that is less polarized than the House. And part of the reason is because people are forced to work across the aisle. Now, sometimes it doesn't get done, and here we are beating our heads against the wall thinking, there's just nothing ever get done. But in the Senate, senators regularly know that they have to have a co-sponsor of a bill from the other side. They don't begin with a party view. They're more autonomous. They have a little bit more ability to shape coalitions. We see sometimes coalitions in the middle of Republicans and Democrats rising up to oppose their leaders. Those things are much harder in the House of Representatives, which is a much more party majority-oriented institution. And I think the somewhat longer version of the argument that John didn't give is some people say, well, our American political system was built on separation of powers. It wasn't really built for parties, but now we have all this polarization. It doesn't fit. Those two systems don't fit very well together. Maybe we should find a way to make it more majoritarian because we've got to get something done. But in some ways you could say that's giving up on the system, right? That's just saying, oh, well, we've got a lot of polarization. Let's at least allow everything to be polarized and just allow things to get done. So I'm actually not fixated on 60 being the number in the Senate. I think there are a lot of things one could do to improve that. I think the holds are a problem, although they're kind of built into the system, so they're hard to get rid of. So I raised the question, well, I don't think that making the Senate a more majoritarian institution is by itself something that corrects our polarization. And ultimately, I don't think it's something that necessarily makes us more civil or allows for civil discourse.
Okay.
Well, now we have time for questions from the audience, and please feel free just to direct your question to one of our discussants. Yes.
Do we have?
I'd like your reaction to a way, almost totally opposite way of looking at this whole issue. both of your approaches seem to assume that the right answer is somewhere in the middle and compromise. And what if we looked at the problem being precisely that the people who are not ideological committed, the uneducated people who don't have ideological commitment, are the ones determining elections based on personality and who's a nice guy. And so we have a divided government that we can't hold accountable. What would it not be more democratic to have ideological positions in a majority position with the president and both houses of Congress? Then people can hold that government accountable for what the consequences of what they do.
I'll start. I think that this idea that, which has been advanced by lots of people in the past, that we need to make the choices starker and it ultimately creates false choices and imposes them upon the electorate. Look at what happened last night. Last night was election night. You had, in Mississippi, the Republican candidate for governor won, but the personhood amendment proposed to the Constitution that would have effectively tried to ban all abortions in the state of Mississippi and overlap into some forms of birth control was rejected. Right? So voters were saying, that's too extreme. Now, if you buy into this, we need more ideological stratification, then you get that, look, it's my way or the highway, whole hog. If you don't like it, kick me out next time. There are people who want that. I think there are people who are invested in polarization and who believe as you do, or maybe who believe that we need more of it, and that would heal. But I don't think it actually reflects the spectrum of thought that's out there in America. People do have a sense of proportion and perspective. In Ohio, they rejected Governor Kasich's collective bargaining reform, but at the same time, they voted to give Ohio the opportunity to opt out from individual mandates and healthcare reform. Same vote, roughly the same margin. People are smart. I believe the American people are smart. They understand a sense of perspective and proportion. And to say that we need to simply do is give them starker, more extreme choices, it's my way or the highway, I think will compound the problem and not accurately reflect the real diversity of opinion. Back in the progressive era, people didn't think about politics as left versus right. They thought about politics as radicals, reactionaries, and reformers. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to thinking about politics with that added dimension.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that I think we're about as far polarized as you could imagine us being. Maybe I should not say that, because every time I say that, it seems to get a little bit worse. But
have you been burned before?
As far down that road as you can get, almost. But your frustration may be that our institutions are built to not be fully majoritarian, so that we have a separation of powers and we have a number of things that can still make it difficult for a determined majority of one side or the other to get things done. One that would take very significant constitutional change. But even if you went in that direction, the question you'd have to ask is, well, would you want fleeting moments of big Democratic reform followed by big Republican reform and sort of big swinging back and forth? That is not necessarily the ideal system either. So I certainly think we're very far on the pendulum to where you want to go, but probably what's holding you back is this, that our institutions are not built to be purely majoritarian, so that last step is not there.
I'll add one quick thing. He spoke earlier about independent voters. I focus on independent voters. We can have a good debate, and I think we will next week in New Orleans, about independent voters. Right now, nearly 40% of the electorate self-identified independent. It is not an accident, to my eyes, that you see a dramatic growth of independents from around 15% when that chart began mid-20th century to nearly 40% today, precisely at the time the parties become more ideologically polarized. It seems very clear to me that is a reaction, that is in effect a proactive rejection of the polarization, people saying that doesn't fit me.
Yes, over here.
A question about polarization. I'm wondering, in one sense, the way the statistics are laid out, you can see the voting patterns become more separated. We have the observation along the line, another observation along the line that one party is most liberal is less liberal than the other party is most conservative. That observation. Isn't there also a general sense that in the last number of decades there's been a slight ideologically overall to the right, so that the center has been moved And I'm wondering if you could speak to that in terms of, is that polarization, though, within, on the right side more of the continuum that really spread? I mean, when you say polarization, how far toward the radical are we going to go?
Joe, start.
Sure. I mean, I think there's some disagreement on some of these things. One point is sometimes we measure people in three categories, Republicans, independents, Democrats, and sometimes we think of conservatives, moderates, liberals. And interestingly, conservatives are bigger than liberals, but Democrats are more Democrats than Republicans. So by one measure, by definition, the Democratic Party is going to have some liberals and moderates, and Republicans have a much greater share of their party be in that conservative group. Mm-hmm. I still think that it's not absolutely certain that they're so different. People who talk about asymmetric polarization, this idea that one side's more polarized than the other, tend to think Republicans are more polarized. But there's some evidence on the other side. When people who are asked if they're conservatives, what they mean by that, there seems to be somewhat of a greater range of things than liberals who are a smaller group but more unified. So. Boy, I could find elections where I see, swing elections in one direction, where you see all the moderate Republicans going and conservative Democrats going in the other types of swing elections. So I don't want to emphasize too much the differences. I think both parties have lost their moderates, and it's not so long ago that we had them, and they're gone now. So I think it's pretty strong on both sides.
I do think, though, the party purge impulse, which is sometimes called rhino hunting, Republicans in name only, is particularly pronounced on the Republican side, has developed over several election cycles. You're starting to see its corollary, dino hunting. Sometimes these centrist Democrats are derided as conservadems, the primary challenge to Blanche Lincoln last time, et cetera. In both cases, what you see is sort of a sense that, the problem with our party is that we're not conservative or liberal enough. But I do think, as John said, if you look at the ideological split in the country, that Republicans, we're essentially a center-right country if you divide it ideologically, but the Republicans have done a pretty good job of purging their centrists, and that ultimately is a problem for the Republican Party if they could see it. They probably would have taken the Senate last time, for example, if they didn't nominate Christine O'Donnell and Sharon Engel, but they did, with a lot of great cheer and fanfare. The question that's going to be interesting is whether Democrats really own that numeric necessity to reach out to the center to get their 20% of liberals and to build on that base, or whether they fall into a sort of a reactive cycle of incitement that polarizes them further, which I think will be much more immediately self-defeating. This presidential election will be fascinating. I mean, we've got a situation where the President of the United States, conservatives think he's a socialist, liberals think he's a corporate sellout. Well, that's crazy to me. But I mean, and yet, that's sort of one of the fault lines of the debate. I think it's more a function of sort of a Rorschach test about how schizophrenic our politics have become than anything having to do with the president or the administration.
Yes, Frank.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. With all of the emphasis on who's in charge and discussion on the system itself, whether it's functioning or not functioning, what is the danger or outrage, maybe yes or no, on really key issues being crowded out? The focus of the discussion is more on who's in charge and what are the issues from the general kinds of issues like the role of the United States in the world, or what's the role of society in the less fortunate, to very specific issues like Medicare and dependence and Social Security and those kinds of things. Or are the American people smart enough to figure it out and have these discussions in other ways?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, of course, some media and some people focus too much on leaders and personalities, but in some ways reality is hitting here, right? I mean, joking about the Greeks and the Italians, but we have our own very, very significant fiscal issues, and both parties recognize it. They have different views about these things. I guess my worry is this. I do think there's an argument, and one that our institution, I think, has in the background of its mission, that some of the really big problems you do need buy-in from both parties, not only because of the ideas of both parties, but for political cover. That's always the way hard things got done. You didn't want to, in 1982, reform Social Security with just one party. You wanted to have the other party there to help you with political cover. And I still think that's a model to be followed, but the parties are just farther apart now. And there's some question of whether they can do that much, whether they can do as big and significant things, recognizing they need each other, or whether we're just going to get kind of the minimum, which I fear that we're going to end up.
I feel with a real sense of urgency that we are on the verge of a real credibility crisis about the strength of our democracy's capacity for self-government. In the 1930s, you heard a lot of people during that economic turmoil say that that democracies, pluralistic democracies, were inefficient, couldn't get anything great done in a short period of time. So there was this tendency, frankly, that Washington warned about in the farewell address, to go to the great man, i.e., that's the nice name for a dictator, someone who could get things done. You had the S&P downgrade that specifically blamed our political brinksmanship. Less a fiscal crisis than a political crisis. You have Ben Bernanke echo the same thing. You have the Chinese looking on with some degree of delight, rising powers saying, look at the inefficiency. They're shooting themselves in the foot. They're self-sabotaging themselves economically and otherwise. Over what is comparatively, in this global sense, fairly small differences, folks. There are exaggerated fears and suspicions about the other side. There is, in fact, on any given issue, a tremendous amount of common ground that we could define and build on. That's largely what the Bipartisan Center does and why it's so important, to help define that common ground that exists and then build upon it. Not deny that there are principal differences and the parties are polarized, but on issue after issue, whether you're talking about immigration or energy independence, quote unquote, or dealing with the deficit and the debt, there's a lot of common ground that can be found. The super committee right now is right on the verge. This week is sort of the make or break. They've got to present something by the 23rd. And they've got to present it before to have it scored, et cetera, et cetera. Look, we can disagree with a lot. There's 140 folks in the Senate and the House who said go big to $4 trillion, the outlines of the grand bargain, which S&P sent out as sort of what's needed to get our nation on track, rather than 1.5, 1.2 they're mandated. You can do it through tax reform and entitlement reform. You can do it without you can raise revenues without raising rates. You can close loopholes, maybe even reduce some rates. Bowles-Simpson did this. Ribble and Domenici Commission did this. The Gang of Six did this. The path is known. The political will is lacking because the extremes have hijacked the debate and people are afraid to do what they know is necessary. You're starting to see little inklings. There's an article in the Hill today of defiance against Grover Norquist and those pledge folks. People saying, we're going to put the Pledge of Allegiance ahead of any pledge we took to some activist group. But that's what's necessary right now. And I can't state it enough. I mean, if we fail in this, we really undercut the credibility of a democratic republic to govern itself effectively. Just take a big step back. I don't want to sound too dire, but if we have self-inflicted wounds that come out of this polarization of our political process, that becomes a real problem, a credibility problem. And so we should think about these things in that widest sense of perspective. To feel a sense of urgency to solve these problems, because they're solvable. We're just not doing it right now because I think we've had the extremes hijack and disproportionately dominate the debate. I have to catch a flight, which I'm really sorry about. So I'm going to squirrel out of here and leave you with my very thanks.
We have time for
We have more time? Okay.
Yeah. If anyone would like to ask another question, we still have time for some discussion with John Fortier. So
unless there's a foot of snow out there.
Then you have to. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
What is your opinion about term limits would help promote more civil discourse?
Yeah, term limits. Certainly, we had a big movement towards term limits in 1994 with Republicans coming in office. We've seen some experiments with it in state legislatures. Some of them have implemented this. I guess I'm a bit skeptical about them for a couple of reasons. One, they don't seem to deliver what they promise. I think people look at them and say, should we have term limits because people are in office too long and they get cozy with lobbyists or interests, and that somehow we'll break the nexus, or we'll get a lot more citizen politicians. We won't have as many career politicians. And the studies we've done of state legislatures seem to show that that's not true. That kind of maybe counterintuitive, but that junior members of legislatures tend to be much more beholden to interests. They come into office, they don't know as much, they don't have as many friends or connections to people, and they rely on certain particular interests that have been with them in the campaign or come to them and influence them. And then on the career politician, that doesn't seem to really help that much either. A lot of people you see, they'll have 6 years or 10 years in the House, and then they'll flip over to the Senate, and so they remain career politicians. There's a little more shifting around. Hasn't really even shown much help for bringing more women into office. There are a lot of things that are promised that don't seem to be there. So I guess I'm not sure that that's a good thing in general, and whether it helps polarization. I guess my suspicion is that arguably it might actually make it worse. That often people are the most polarized when they come in big waves. Right now, Republicans are kind of on the spot because they've got lots of freshmen, lots of Tea Party freshmen. I don't want to tell you that they're all going to kind of go Washington and forget their core views, but there is some way in which even the most ideologically determined members who come into these big wave elections, who stick around for a while, find ways to work in the body. They may still be strong conservatives, but they're maybe not going to be the most populist and against the institution that they were when they came in. I was in a discussion the other day where someone was remembering the class of 1974, a big Democratic class, and he said, this was a Republican former member speaking, said, we survived all of you guys coming in, the institution will survive the Tea Party Republicans. So I guess I think that term limits may actually sort of allow people to reflect in a big election with more open seats, a certain view that's coursing through the electorate at that election time, conservative view or liberal view, but it's not necessarily going to elect people who are going to find better ways to work together, and it's, I think, by the evidence, not really going to break some connection with special interests, more likely to make it worse.
Yes, in the back.
There's quite a bit of social science research that shows that women tend to be more collaborative and bipartisan. We still have accomplished only 17% women in the state legislature, so about 4%. So, is any research that you do, either to bipartisan candidates suggest that women do tend to be more bipartisan when they're in elected office?
No, we haven't done that research, but I have seen some of that, and you do have sort of especially over the course of time, rising numbers of women, and one interesting fact is the women in the Senate, which are, I remember now, 16 or 17, have a regular meeting, which is of course bipartisan. They're Republican and Democratic women senators, and just a meeting by itself is not evidence that all the problems have gone away, but there is a sense that they have among themselves, that they have a practical set of working relationships across the aisle, partly because of that meeting. So I have seen some of that research. We haven't done it ourselves, and I think that's we are likely to see more women over time in office. I believe certainly other countries have larger percentages of their legislatures, but ours has increased over time.
Yes.
To continue on the thought about term limits, what about the senators like Byrd or Strom Thurmond who were in their 90s, and you read that their age are really going to work because they can, or someone who's in terminal illness like Ted Kennedy with a brain cancer, these people are ineffective.
Right. Well, I was hearing earlier John's talk about the filibuster and Strom Thurmond, and the only thing in the old days that limited it was his bladder. And I thought, especially when it was a 99-year-old bladder, that was potentially a limit on the filibuster. Because obviously he was our, you mentioned our longest serving and our oldest senators. Yeah, term limits, obviously they wouldn't have lasted as long, but we do have elections, and your beef might be with Senate elections, which are every 6 years, and we certainly do have the case where sometimes over the course of a long term like that, people become ill, and there's a time where you wonder how personally effective they are. But we do have elections. We do have people who have been, I don't want to say it's the only issue, but a significant issue is this person still up to snuff? Are they still functioning as well? Are they as effective as they were? I think of a Delaware election with Bill Roth, a very, very powerful chairman of the Finance Committee, who was turned out in part because people thought he was not quite up to it. He had moments on the campaign trail where they thought, well, we want a more, a newer, younger, more vigorous face. So there still are elections, and I was in Mexico a few 6 to 8 months ago, and Mexico is the exact opposite of us. They don't allow re-election for anything. Every office is just held once: the presidency, the Congress, the mayor, and that has horrible problems because the real power brokers are behind the scenes. No politician can go out there and kind of make the case themselves, establish their own independent base. It's all controlled by people behind the scenes. But they're talking about moving in this direction, and I guess I would just say that we do have frequent elections, and there are opportunities for people to weigh in. And yes, incumbents are elected a lot, but we do have these wave elections as well, or primaries, which give people opportunity to replace people.
On this side of the room here, you guys have been a little less.
Is that the right or the left?
I can't
where
tell.
you're sitting.
Yeah, exactly. This side of the aisle.
For us, it's the right. Give us the left.
He went over here. I have a question for John. No takers. Pete.
I'll jump over here. Two things. One, could you speak a little bit about Bob Bennett and what happened in Utah? And I know he's now active in the Bipartisan Policy Center. So I'll start with that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Senator Bennett was I think by almost every objective voting measure, a pretty conservative Republican from a conservative state, Utah, and a long-time serving member, but very, I would say, very institutional senator, and one who sometimes would work across the aisle, and was then not elected in the last election because he was beaten in, I would say, a primary, but they don't even have a primary in Utah. They have a convention, so a smaller group of Republicans come together to decide who the nominee is. And essentially he was beaten by two Tea Party relatively unknown Republicans who became the two that actually went on the ballot. He didn't even get to appear on the ballot as the two got the support of this convention. I mean, I do think it illustrates, that we do need to think about the way in which we elect people in these primary areas. Now, I'm not here advocating against the Iowa caucuses. I will make myself not unpopular in this room. And interestingly, while caucuses are sort of somewhat by definition a little lower turnout than primaries, of course, yours is so prominent and the energy spent on it is intense enough that there is, I believe, a very significant reflection of people's views in Iowa. I will say, some of these later caucuses, when you get further down the line, are really low turnout, and you wonder whether they emphasize only the few activists who show up rather than a broader group who you can get to show up. So I do think that Senator Bennett's loss illustrates that one point, that the way in which our parties elect people is important, and that had there been a primary in Utah, I think he would have won. Yes, there might have been some dissatisfaction from his right and said, maybe this strong Republican year, you compromise too much with Democrats, you work too much of Washington, too much of the institution. That might have held some sway against him, but I have no doubt that he would have won. But in this very small group of insiders, this is one place where I think the systemic way in which we pick the parties, especially in Utah, contributed to the polarization.
And the second has to do with the healthcare reform discussion that was going on, and that's my area of policy research. And it seems like what you all have been talking about, both are sort of wrapped up into that. In the one sense, because you had the polarization within the Congress, it allowed the Democrats that had control of the House and the Senate to actually get something done in a way that even 20 years ago Clinton wasn't able to do, because you could get the committee chairs to agree that we were going to have a fewer number of committees looking at bills. You had the 3 in the House, you basically had the 2 in the Senate, the 1, and it almost, the whole thing was written in the end by that group of 6 in the Senate, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. So that part, it seemed, was very good. But then in the end, when the Republicans were starting to see that this might actually happen and was not going to be good politically, and then the differences, as I understand it from people that were in the room, weren't that great, then the Republicans started backing away, and then you started seeing the partisanship because it might have passed. And so it seems like that's almost a representation of both, but I'm just curious your perception of that.
Well, I do think that there is too often in Washington on all sorts of issues, some of these big issues, just an immediate reaction that, well, if the other party is proposing it, we're against it. It happens on both sides of the aisle, and I think certainly it happened in healthcare. I do think that this was Democrats over two elections, over 2006 and 2008, had very significant gains and did control all the parts of government. And so even if we talk about the moderating influences of wanting to make sure the middle is represented and our separation of powers, even in these times, you can get a time where the parties win everything. In some ways, the argument that elections have consequences we shouldn't be completely afraid of, even if we're worried about partisanship. So the Democrats at the end of the day got to write the bill more or less themselves. There's another election for people to reflect on. So I don't think we're calling for unresponsiveness. But what I think you're getting at is that might there have been a more of a consensus way to do healthcare? The differences of opinion are strong. You're right. Maybe underlying sort of differences of policy. If you gave Republicans the ability to change some things in healthcare, you might have found, and Senator Bennett had a plan with Senator Wyden, which tried to bridge some of those gaps. You might find that there's some common ground. But boy, it was hard to find that because of the sense that parties want to work alone. I mean, I know a lot of Republicans who feel like Democrats didn't give them enough way to reflect their views. That Democrats were looking to pick off one or two Republicans and governed with Democrats plus one or two. They resented that. I think a lot of Democrats thought, hey, Republicans supported many of these underlying ideas. Now they're against them just because we're in power. Those are hard things that we're struggling with. But again, I don't think that it's easily overcome. I think that it's imaginable that when one party controls all of these things, which probably isn't going to be that often, when you control a 60-vote majority in the Senate plus the other branches, that you can do things, but that you're going to do them with the support of the other party. It probably in our system is not likely to happen.
Is there a question? Is there still a question back there? Yeah.
Yeah, I do. A somewhat uninformed question, but I think it's a framing sort of issue. I think it's working around a lot of the observations you made. It's something to do with the deliberative ethos of the Congress. It seems like as an issue of political culture, that's routine. And I'm thinking back to the early Republic. We had this business of the anti-federalists that had a mirror image of representation. The federalists had more of a filter image of the representative would be. There was a sense that once elected, you engage one another in deliberation, and you are each other's primary audience, or at least for the moment. And maybe this has to do with media practices and development of media politics and presidents talking to House and Congress, directing the Republics, and that sort of thing. But I wonder if you could, from a lot of what you said, it seems to me, could speak to this question of this political culture itself, not just ideological and other kinds of signs and manifestations of this, but just the culture itself in some sort of culture of deliberation in some sort of organized state.
Right, I do think the culture of deliberation in Congress is much less than it was, and some of the factors that these former members point to of just physical and social interactions, the time in Washington. I mean, people point to things like air conditioning and plane travel as factors, right? Those members who couldn't go back to Seattle or even to Iowa for the weekend now easily can, makes the place a more impersonal, harder to know. I mean, even harder to know people of your own party. I know it, obviously the worry we have is knowing across the aisle, but it's more impersonal and harder to make those deals and negotiations. I also do want to emphasize this committee aspect of it again, that the committees are still tremendously important in Congress. I don't want to say that they're not. They are a primary kind of specialized place where people can get into, know what area begins most legislation, and yet they are not the places that they were. And those places had a kind of deliberation that was, yes, of course, there are public hearings, but often private and hashing things out. And the polarization combined with the light that we shine on Congress, much of which is very good. We don't want people running around doing things that we don't know about, but I know people have called, for example, the super committee should be hold their deliberations in public. Well, that would be a disaster, right? Nothing would get done. It would be posturing. And so the ability to spend a significant amount of time in substantive areas on committees and not as much be reflecting back home. Everything you say is being watched by your most rabid supporters at home every second you do it. You're not always being watched over by your party leader. You have a kind of workmanship-like deliberative relationship at this smaller level. And that's, I think, one of the things that we've lost with the old system. The old system may have been too hard to get things done and diffuse in many ways, but the good side about that is that there was much more ability for individual members to engage with the other side or to engage in very serious deliberation that I think today is lost.
I'd just like to, if you could just end and just tell people a little bit about the Bipartisan Policy Center, what it is and what you're trying to do.
Sure. We are a relatively new organization. We have kind of two foundings, one 10 years ago, but the more recent one 5 years ago, as the full version of what we are, was founded by 4 former majority leaders, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, Bob Dole, Howard Baker, Tom Daschle, and George Mitchell. And, essentially it began with this idea that to get things done on major policy areas, you often are going to need to have the views of both parties, fully reflected, not just a one-party view like many think tanks are, or one party plus picking off a few of the moderates of the other side to have a sort of facade bipartisanship. But to get something done on what we began with, things on energy policy, transportation, other things, we wanted people who had real views that were respected by each party to come together and to hash things out and to find some ways in which there was common ground. And that doesn't always carry the day in Washington, but it can be very influential. That these hashing out of things can provide the basis for those moments where the parties finally say, "Oh, we've been fighting, but now we need some very practical things that we can agree on." And we have very prominently in our debt commission with former Republican Senator Pete Domenici and former Democratic O&B director and budget director Alice Rivlin and a committee of others from both sides proposed a very significant set of debt and deficit reduction proposals, like similar to Simpson-Bowles, which is another effort in that direction. So in some ways, the whole institution is dedicated towards having these commissions of sorts bring together respected people of both parties that reflect the current differences and putting them in a room and forcing them to come out with compromises which could serve as the basis for moving forward on a number of different issues.
Well, thanks a lot, John, for sticking it out here, and we really enjoyed hearing from both panelists, and I appreciate you all coming. Thanks a lot.